The spring auction yard buzzed with desperate voices and the sharp crack of the auctioneer's gavel, but Sadie Malone stood silent in the crowd, her hands trembling as she clutched the torn envelope containing her father's final letter. 3 months since consumption took him, and now the bank meant to take everything else. The small homestead, the few acres of good bottomland, even her mother's china that had traveled west in a covered wagon 20 years past. Next lot, folks. The Malone property, 40 acres of prime farming land with a decent cabin and outbuildings. The auctioneer's voice carried over the murmur of men calculating what they could afford and what they could steal. Sadie's stomach twisted as she watched the faces in the crowd, some sympathetic, others calculating, a few openly hungry for her misfortune. She tried everything. Worked her fingers raw taking in washing and mending, sold her mother's wedding ring, even considered the unthinkable offers from men who saw a 22-year-old woman alone as easy prey. But it wasn't enough. Never enough. The debt her father had hidden from her, notes signed in desperation during the bad winter 2 years back, now demanded payment in full. Opening bid is $500, the auctioneer called, and Sadie's heart sank further. She had $43.18 in her worn leather purse. Might as well have been empty. A man near the front of the crowd raised his hand. Sadie recognized him. Fletcher Grimsby, who owned the largest spread in 3 counties and had a reputation for driving hard bargains and harder men. His cold eyes found hers across the crowd, and his smile held no warmth. She'd heard the talk in town about Grimsby's interest in expanding his holdings, buying up failed homesteads for a fraction of their worth. $500, came another voice, this one from the back. Sadie craned her neck but couldn't see who'd spoken. The bidding continued, voices calling out numbers that climbed higher and higher, well beyond anything she could dream of matching. When the gavel finally fell at $950, Sadie felt something die inside her chest. The auctioneer called for the successful bidder to come forward, and Sadie watched as a man made his way through the crowd. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing clothes that had seen honest work but weren't quite as patched as they might have been. His hat was pulled low, but she could see dark hair that needed cutting and hands that bore calluses from real labor. Daniel Harper, he said when the auctioneer asked for his name, his voice carrying a slight drawl that spoke of somewhere south of here. I'll need a few days to arrange the funds if that's acceptable. The auctioneer nodded, making notes in his ledger. Sadie stood frozen, watching this stranger claim everything that had ever mattered to her. The homestead where her parents had built their dreams. The kitchen where her mother had taught her to make bread and preserve peaches. The small room where she'd been born during a spring thunderstorm much like the one threatening now. Miss Malone? The voice was gentle, and Sadie looked up to find the buyer standing before her. Up close, she could see his eyes were deep brown, almost black, and held something she hadn't expected, kindness. I wonder if I might have a word? Sadie's throat felt tight, but she managed a nod. They walked away from the crowd, stopping beside a weathered fence post where they could speak without being overheard. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the distant sound of thunder. I know this can't be easy, Daniel Harper said, removing his hat and running his fingers through his hair. Losing your family's place like this. Sadie lifted her chin, trying to hold on to what dignity remained. It's done now. Papa's debt is paid and you've got yourself some good land. Her voice only cracked a little on the words. That's what I wanted to talk about. Daniel shifted his weight, seeming to choose his words carefully. I bought the place, true enough, but I'm not much for farming. Been working cattle most of my life, down in Texas. This land, though, it's meant for crops, not grazing. Sadie frowned, not understanding where this was leading. What I'm thinking, Daniel continued, is that I need someone who knows the land, knows how to work it proper. Someone who can teach me what I don't know about farming in this territory. The first drops of rain began to fall, heavy and warm. Sadie pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. I don't follow your meaning, Mr. Harper. I'm offering you a position. Partnership, you might say. You'd stay on the property, keep the house, work the land like you always have. I'd provide the capital for seed, tools, whatever's needed. We'd split the profits come harvest time. Sadie stared at him, certain she'd misunderstood. You want to give me my own land back? Not give. This would be a working arrangement, fair to both parties. You'd earn your share through honest labor, and I'd learn what I need to know about farming from someone who grew up with dirt under her fingernails. The rain was coming harder now, sending people scurrying for shelter. Daniel pulled off his coat and held it over both their heads, standing close enough that Sadie could smell the clean scent of soap and something else, leather and horses and the wide spaces he'd mentioned. Why? She asked, having to raise her voice over the drumming rain. Why would you do such a thing for a stranger? Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching the storm sweep across the auction yard. My mother died when I was about your age. Lost everything too. Would have given considerable for someone to offer her a chance to stay on the land that was rightfully hers. He looked down at Sadie, water dripping from the brim of his hat. Sometimes we get the chance to be the help we wish had been there for someone we loved. Sadie's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with the rain. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it. I've got to head into town to arrange the payment, but I'll be back day after tomorrow. If you're agreeable, we can work out the details then. Before Sadie could respond, Daniel was striding away through the rain, leaving her standing beside the fence post with his words echoing in her mind. Around her, the auction yard emptied as people sought shelter from the storm, but Sadie remained where she was, letting the rain wash over her as she tried to understand what had just happened. That night, alone in the cabin that might not be lost after all, Sadie sat by the firelight reading her father's letter again. The paper was worn soft from handling, the ink faded but still legible. In it, he'd apologized for the debt, for the burden he was leaving her, for all the ways he felt he'd failed as a father and provider. But he'd also written about the land itself, how good the soil was, how the creek never ran dry even in the worst droughts, how the cabin sat positioned just right to catch the morning sun and stay cool in the afternoon heat. This land has heart, he'd written in his careful script. It'll provide for you if you treat it right, if you understand what it needs. Don't let them convince you it's worthless just because times are hard. Good land and honest work can see a person through most anything. Sadie folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the drawer where she kept her most precious things. Her mother's Bible, her grandmother's thimble, a pressed flower from her first successful garden. Perhaps her father's words about the land having heart had been more true than she'd realized. Perhaps the heart of a place could call to the right kind of person at the right moment. 2 days later, Sadie stood in the cabin doorway, watching Daniel Harper ride up the lane on a sturdy bay horse. He was leading a pack mule loaded with supplies, and something about the way he sat his saddle spoke of countless miles traveled and hard country crossed. When he dismounted, his movements were fluid and sure, the actions of a man comfortable in his own skin. Miss Malone, he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting, I hope you've had time to consider my proposal. Sadie had done little else but think about it. She'd walked every inch of the property, remembering her father's lessons about crop rotation and soil management, her mother's wisdom about preserving and planning. She'd calculated what it would take to plant a successful crop, what the profits might be if the weather held fair and the market stayed steady. The numbers made sense, but more than that, the idea of staying on the land, of continuing the work her parents had started, felt like the only path that honored their memory. I've considered it, she said, stepping out into the morning sunshine. and I'm willing to try this partnership if you're still of the same mind." Daniel smiled, and Sadie realized it was the first genuine smile she'd seen from anyone in weeks. "I am indeed. I've got papers drawn up in town if you'd like to look them over. Nothing binding until you're satisfied with the terms." They spent the morning going through the documents Daniel had prepared with the territorial lawyer. The agreement was more generous than Sadie had dared hope, a 50-50 split of all profits from crops, with Sadie maintaining residence in the cabin and full authority over farming decisions. Daniel would provide capital for supplies and equipment, but wouldn't interfere with the day-to-day work unless asked. "You're trusting me with a considerable investment," Sadie observed as she read through the contract terms. "How do you know I won't take your money and produce nothing but weeds?" Daniel was examining the fireplace, running his hands over the carefully fitted stones. "Because I've seen how you care for what's yours. This place shows a woman's touch, not just in the house but in the way the outbuildings are maintained, how the garden plots are laid out. Someone who takes that kind of care with small things will do right by large ones." Sadie felt heat creep up her neck at the unexpected praise. She wasn't accustomed to compliments, especially from men who had reason to notice her work. Papa always said the details matter most. Wise man. Daniel straightened, meeting her eyes across the cabin's main room. "I brought supplies to get us started if you're agreeable to the terms." Sadie looked down at the papers in her hands, then at the man who'd offered her a future when she'd thought all futures were closed to her. "I'm agreeable, Mr. Harper." They shook hands on it, Daniel's grip firm and calloused and surprisingly gentle. When he released her hand, Sadie felt something shift inside her chest. Not just relief at keeping the homestead, but something warmer and more uncertain. The rest of the day was spent in practical matters. Daniel proved himself handy with tools, helping Sadie repair a section of fence that had been damaged in the spring storms. He worked with easy efficiency, clearly comfortable with physical labor, but Sadie noticed that his clothes, while worn, were of better quality than most working men could afford. His boots were well-made leather, his tools newer than hers and carefully maintained. "You said you worked cattle in Texas," Sadie said as they reset a fence post. "What brought you north to farming country?" Daniel paused in his work, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Sometimes a man needs a change of scenery. Texas got too familiar. Thought I'd try my hand at something new, maybe put down roots for a change." There was something in his voice that discouraged further questions, and Sadie let the subject drop. Everyone had reasons for the choices they made, and not all of them were meant for sharing with near strangers. She had secrets of her own, the humiliating proposals she'd received from men who thought a woman alone would accept any offer, the nights she'd cried herself to sleep after her father's death, the desperate measures she'd considered and rejected in her darkest moments. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Daniel gathered his tools and prepared to head back to town. "I'll be staying at the hotel for now until I can figure out more permanent arrangements. Tomorrow I thought we might ride into town together, get the seed and supplies we'll need for spring planting." Sadie nodded, then hesitated. "Mr. Harper? I want to thank you again for this opportunity. I know it's not common, a man and woman entering into business arrangements like this." Daniel secured his tools to his saddle, his movements deliberate and careful. "In my experience, Miss Malone, the most worthwhile things in life aren't common. I have a feeling this partnership will prove beneficial to both of us." After he rode away, Sadie stood in her dooryard watching the last light fade from the sky. The land stretched out around her in all directions. The good bottomland where corn would grow tall and strong, the higher ground suitable for wheat, the kitchen garden plot where she'd plant vegetables and herbs. It was still hers in all the ways that mattered. Not hers by deed and title, perhaps, but hers to work and tend and coax into abundance. The next morning dawned clear and warm, with the kind of golden light that promised a fine day ahead. Sadie dressed in her best work dress, not fancy but clean and mended, with her mother's cameo pinned at the throat. She braided her dark hair neatly and covered it with her second-best bonnet, the one without holes in the crown. Daniel arrived precisely when he'd said he would, leading a gentle mare saddled for riding. "Thought you might prefer this to walking to town?" he said, dismounting to help her up. Sadie hadn't ridden in months, not since she'd been forced to sell her father's horse to pay for medicine that hadn't helped. The mare was well-trained and responsive, with an easy gait that ate up the miles to town without jarring. As they rode, Daniel pointed out landmarks and asked questions about the local terrain, clearly working to understand the lay of the land he'd purchased. "That creek there," Sadie said, indicating a line of cottonwoods, "never runs dry even in drought years. Papa used to say it was fed by springs up in the hills. Good water for livestock or irrigation if needed." Daniel studied the creek with interest. "That's valuable information. In Texas, reliable water can mean the difference between prosperity and failure." They spent the morning at Miller's General Store, selecting seed corn and wheat, discussing varieties suited to local growing conditions with the storekeeper who'd known Sadie's family for years. Daniel paid for everything without comment, though Sadie noticed he carried a roll of bills that would have represented several years' income for most farmers. "You planning to work that Malone place yourself, Mr. Harper?" Miller asked as he tallied the purchases. "That's good land, but it takes considerable know-how to farm it proper. Miss Malone will be managing the agricultural operations," Daniel replied smoothly. "I'm more of an investor in this venture." Miller's eyebrows rose, but he was too polite to comment directly on the unusual arrangement. Sadie felt grateful for Daniel's matter-of-fact tone, the way he presented their partnership as perfectly natural and respectable. On the ride home, their horses loaded with supplies, Daniel asked more questions about farming techniques, crop rotation and soil management. His questions were intelligent and showed he'd been thinking seriously about agriculture, but there was something in the way he asked them that suggested book learning rather than experience. "You said you worked cattle," Sadie observed. "But you seem to know quite a bit about farming for a cowhand." Daniel was quiet for a moment, guiding his horse around a muddy patch in the road. "I had opportunities to observe different types of operations. A man learns by watching if he pays attention." Again, Sadie sensed there were depths to Daniel Harper that he wasn't ready to reveal. But then, she reasoned, a woman in her position couldn't afford to be too curious about a man's past. What mattered was his character in the present, and so far he'd shown himself to be honest, generous, and hard-working. Back at the homestead, they spent the afternoon preparing for planting. Daniel proved surprisingly knowledgeable about soil preparation, though his hands showed he was more accustomed to rope and leather than plow handles. Sadie found herself watching him work, noting the careful way he approached each task, the way he listened when she offered instruction or correction. "In Texas," he said as they worked side by side preparing seed beds, "the soil's different. Harder, more alkaline. This black earth you have here, it's like nothing I've seen." Sadie scooped up a handful of the rich, dark soil, letting it run through her fingers. "Papa used to say this land was blessed. Good drainage but holds moisture when needed. The early settlers knew what they were about when they claimed this area." As the days passed, they fell into a rhythm of shared work and careful conversation. Daniel proved himself willing to learn and quick to understand, though Sadie noticed he sometimes had to catch himself when his natural inclinations ran counter to farming wisdom. Once, she saw him start to mount his horse from the wrong side, then correct himself with a rueful shake of his head. "Old habits," he said when he caught her watching. "We all have them," Sadie replied, though she filed the observation away with all the other small inconsistencies she'd noticed about her new partner. The spring planting went smoothly, with Daniel providing the labor Sadie couldn't manage alone. He was strong and tireless, capable of working from dawn to dusk without complaint. In the evenings, they would sit on the cabin's front porch, planning the next day's work and discussing the weather signs. "Rain tomorrow," Sadie said one evening, studying the clouds gathering on the horizon. "Can see it in the way the swallows are flying low." Daniel followed her gaze to the dark line of clouds. "In Texas, we watched for dust devils and tornadoes this time of year. Rain was always a blessing, never a certainty." "It's different here," Sadie agreed. "More reliable, but you have to time things right. Plant too early and a late frost will kill everything. Too late and the summer heat stunts the growth." They were sitting close enough that Sadie could smell the clean scent of soap and honest sweat, could hear the steady rhythm of Daniel's breathing. In the gathering dusk, with the promise of rain in the air and the planted fields stretching out before them, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: contentment. Not happiness exactly, but a quiet satisfaction with the present moment. "Miss Malone," Daniel said into the comfortable silence, "I hope you don't mind my asking, but were you never, that is, did you never have a beau? Someone who might have helped you through the difficulties after your father's passing?" Sadie felt heat creep up her neck. "There was someone once. Before Papa got sick. But when times got hard." She shrugged, trying to convey the pain of abandonment without giving it words. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "His loss," he said finally, and there was something in his voice that made Sadie look at him more closely. But his face was shadowed in the twilight, impossible to read. The rain came as Sadie had predicted, a gentle soaking that would give the newly planted seeds the moisture they needed to sprout. Sadie and Daniel spent the rainy day in the cabin, Sadie mending clothes while Daniel worked on repairing a broken harness with tools from his well-supplied kit. "You're handy with leather work," Sadie observed, watching him stitch with practiced ease. "Man learns what he needs to know," Daniel replied, not looking up from his work. "Leather and rope, they're essential tools no matter what kind of life you're living." Sadie noticed he'd said tools, not trade, a subtle distinction that suggested familiarity rather than profession. Another small piece of the puzzle that was Daniel Harper, filed away with all the others she'd been collecting. As the spring progressed into early summer, their partnership settled into comfortable routine. The crops came up strong and healthy, rows of green corn reaching toward the sun, wheat heads beginning to form in the higher fields. Daniel proved himself invaluable for the heavy work, plowing, cultivating, hauling water during dry spells. But Sadie noticed he deferred to her completely on all farming decisions, never questioning her judgment even when her choices might have seemed counterintuitive to someone less experienced. "Why do you cut the corn stalks so high?" he asked one day as they worked in the field together. "Seems like waste, leaving good growth in the ground." Sadie wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "The stubble protects the soil over winter, keeps it from washing away in spring rains. Next year we'll plow it under to add richness to the earth. Papa taught me that the land has to be fed as much as it feeds us." Daniel nodded thoughtfully, filing the information away. "Makes sense. In Texas, we never thought much about soil conservation. Land was cheap and plentiful, easier to move on than improve what you had." "This land's different," Sadie said, looking out over the growing crops with pride and satisfaction. "It rewards care and attention. Treats you right if you treat it right." Daniel followed her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "Like most worthwhile things, I expect." Something in his tone made Sadie look at him more closely, but he'd already turned back to his work, leaving her to wonder what deeper meaning might have been intended in his words. By midsummer, The crops were thriving beyond Sadie's most optimistic projections. The corn stood tall and strong, the wheat heads heavy with grain, and the kitchen garden provided more vegetables than she and Daniel could possibly consume. They began preserving the surplus, Sadie teaching Daniel the arts of canning and drying that would see them through the winter months ahead. "Never learned such things before," Daniel admitted as he helped her string beans for drying. "Always took it for granted that food would be available when needed." Sadie glanced at him curiously. Even poor men usually knew something about food preservation, especially those who'd worked cattle in remote areas. "Your mother didn't teach you these things?" Daniel's hands stilled on the beans. "She died when I was young, as I mentioned. I was sent away to be raised by relatives who had different ideas about what a boy needed to learn." There was pain in his voice, old and carefully contained. Sadie let the subject drop, though she filed away another piece of the puzzle. A boy sent away from home, raised by relatives? That might explain the strange mixture of education and practical ignorance she'd observed in Daniel. As the days grew longer and warmer, their working partnership evolved into something deeper. They shared meals now, Sadie cooking for both of them rather than maintaining the formal separation they'd started with. Daniel proved to have a fine appreciation for good food and often complimented her cooking in ways that made her blush with unexpected pleasure. "This cornbread," he said one evening, helping himself to a third piece, "reminds me of something my mother used to make. She had a way with cornmeal that could make even hard times taste good." Sadie smiled, pleased by the comparison. "It's Mama's recipe. She said the secret was using buttermilk and cooking it in a cast iron pan that's been in the oven long enough to get proper hot." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "My mother would have liked you. She believed in the value of skills passed down from one woman to another." Such conversations became more frequent as the summer progressed. Daniel began sharing memories of his childhood, though Sadie noticed he was careful to keep details vague. A picture emerged of a boy who'd lost his mother young, been separated from his father for reasons that remained unclear, and grown up with advantages that hadn't necessarily made him happy. "Education's important," he said one evening as he helped Sadie with figures in her father's old account ledger. "But there's wisdom in knowing how to work with your hands, how to make something grow from nothing." Sadie looked up from the columns of numbers, studying his face in the lamplight. "You speak like someone who's had both education and hard experience." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his pencil poised over the ledger. "Sometimes life gives you more of one than the other, whether you want it or not." The evening of the 4th of July, the entire community gathered at Miller's Grove for a celebration. Sadie hadn't attended such gatherings since her father's death, but Daniel encouraged her to go, offering to escort her if she felt uncomfortable attending alone. "Folks will be expecting to meet my partner," he said as they walked toward the sound of fiddle music and laughter. "Might be good for business to show we're serious about being part of the community." Sadie had taken extra care with her appearance, wearing her best dress, a blue calico her mother had sewn 2 summers past, and pinning her hair up with her grandmother's silver combs. When Daniel saw her, something flickered in his eyes that made her heart skip in an entirely unexpected way. "You look lovely, Miss Malone," he said, offering his arm with the kind of formal courtesy that seemed natural to him. The celebration was in full swing when they arrived. Tables groaned under the weight of food brought by every family in the county, and children ran between the adults playing games while their parents visited and shared news. Sadie was surprised by the warmth of her reception. She'd expected some coolness given her unusual living arrangement with Daniel, but instead found genuine pleasure in seeing her again. "Sadie Malone," called out Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife and unofficial social leader of the community. "We've missed you at church these past months. And this must be your business partner we've heard so much about." Daniel removed his hat and inclined his head politely. Daniel Harper, ma'am. Pleased to make your acquaintance. Mrs. Patterson studied him with the sharp eyes of a woman accustomed to taking the measure of strangers. You're the one who bought the Malone place at auction? Heard you've got quite an arrangement worked out. Miss Malone is the finest farmer in 3 counties, Daniel replied smoothly. I consider myself fortunate to have her expertise. The way he said it, with genuine respect and not a trace of condescension, seemed to satisfy Mrs. Patterson's concerns about propriety. Sadie felt a rush of gratitude for his diplomatic handling of what could have been an awkward moment. As the evening progressed, Sadie found herself enjoying the celebration more than she'd expected. Daniel proved himself an easy conversationalist, equally comfortable discussing crop prices with the men and complimenting the ladies on their cooking. But Sadie noticed he was careful to keep their personal history vague, deflecting questions about his background with the kind of charm that left people satisfied without actually learning anything substantial. Where exactly in Texas are you from, Mr. Harper? Asked Miller, the storekeeper, as they stood around sampling various offerings from the dessert table. Moved around quite a bit, Daniel replied easily. Never stayed in one place long enough to call it home until now. It was a non-answer delivered with such natural grace that Miller simply nodded and moved on to other topics. But Sadie noticed the way Daniel's hand tightened slightly on his coffee cup, the barely perceptible tension that suggested the deflection cost him something. Later, as they walked home under a sky full of stars, Sadie worked up the courage to voice what had been troubling her. Daniel, I hope you don't mind my asking, but are you running from something? Or someone? He stopped walking, turning to face her in the moonlight. For a long moment he didn't speak, and Sadie feared she'd overstepped the bounds of their partnership. Not running, he said finally. More like, seeking something I couldn't find where I was before. And have you found it? Daniel looked at her then with such intensity that Sadie felt her breath catch. I'm beginning to think I might have. The air between them seemed charged with possibility, and for a moment Sadie thought he might reach for her, might close the distance that separated them. But then he stepped back, offering his arm again in the careful, respectful manner that had become familiar. We should get home, he said quietly. Early day tomorrow. August brought a heat wave that tested both crops and tempers. Day after day, the sun beat down mercilessly while the community prayed for rain that didn't come. Sadie and Daniel spent long hours hauling water from the creek to keep the crops alive, working in the relative cool of early morning and late evening. In Texas, Daniel said one particularly brutal afternoon as they rested in the shade of the barn, we'd lose whole herds in heat like this. Cattle would just lie down and refuse to get up. Sadie fanned herself with her bonnet, too exhausted to do more than nod. The heat seemed to press down on them like a physical weight, making every breath an effort. But even in her misery she was aware of Daniel beside her, his shirt clinging to his broad shoulders with sweat, his dark hair damp around his face. When this breaks, she said, the rain will come all at once. Flooding most likely. We'll need to prepare for that. Daniel turned his head to look at her. How can you be sure? Papa taught me to read the signs. The way the animals are acting, how the air feels, the color of the sky at sunset. It's all building toward something big. She was right. The heat wave broke 3 days later with a thunderstorm that raged for hours, sending torrents of water across the already saturated ground. Sadie and Daniel worked frantically to dig drainage channels around the house and barn, their clothes soaked through within minutes of stepping outside. Lightning split the sky as they struggled to secure a loose section of barn roof, the wind whipping rain into their faces so hard it was difficult to see. Sadie lost her footing on the muddy ground and would have fallen if Daniel hadn't caught her, pulling her against his chest to steady her. For a moment they stood pressed together in the storm, rain streaming down their faces, both breathing hard from exertion and something else entirely. Daniel's arms tightened around her, and Sadie felt the strong, steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "Sadie," he said, his voice barely audible over the thunder, and there was something in the way he spoke her name that made her look up at him. What she saw in his eyes made her own breath catch. Not just concern for her safety, but something deeper and more complex. Desire, yes, but also a tenderness that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. Then another crack of lightning brought them both back to their senses. Daniel released her, though his hands lingered on her arms for just a moment longer than necessary. "We need to get inside," he said, his voice rough. They ran for the cabin, arriving breathless and dripping. Sadie built up the fire while Daniel hung their soaked outer garments near the hearth. The cabin felt small and intimate with both of them inside, the storm raging beyond the walls creating a sense of isolation from the world. "I'll make coffee," Sadie said, needing something to do with her hands, some distraction from the awareness of Daniel moving around the cabin behind her. "Let me," Daniel said, moving to the stove. "You're shivering." It was true, whether from cold or nerves Sadie couldn't say. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and watched Daniel work, noting again the careful precision of his movements, the way he seemed comfortable with domestic tasks despite claiming no experience with them. "You're very capable for a man who's supposedly new to farming life," she observed as he set the coffee to boil. Daniel glanced at her, a shadow of something, guilt? Regret? Crossing his features. "I've always been quick to learn. It's more than that. Sometimes you move like someone who's been doing these things for years, then catch yourself and act uncertain. Like you're playing a part that doesn't quite fit." Daniel was very still, his back to her as he tended the coffee. "What are you suggesting, Sadie?" The use of her first name, without the formal Miss Malone, sent a little shiver through her that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. "I'm not suggesting anything. Just observing." He turned then, meeting her eyes directly. "And what do your observations tell you?" Sadie studied his face in the firelight, noting the fine lines around his eyes, the way he held himself with unconscious authority, the expensive quality of even his work clothes when examined closely. "They tell me you're not what you appear to be. Not a simple cowhand looking to try his hand at farming. There's education in the way you speak, money in the cut of your clothes, authority in the way you carry yourself." Daniel moved closer, his expression serious. "Does that frighten you?" Sadie considered the question honestly. "No. But it makes me wonder why you feel the need to pretend to be something you're not. Maybe because what I really am isn't something any sensible woman would want to be associated with. That sounds like something I should be allowed to judge for myself." Daniel was close enough now that Sadie could see the conflict in his eyes, the war between truth and whatever fears kept him silent. "Sadie, if I told you, if you knew the whole truth about who I am, where I come from, what brought me here, I might understand why a good man would feel the need to run from his past." "You think I'm a good man?" The question was asked quietly, with a vulnerability that made Sadie's heart ache. "I think you're the kind of man who would save a stranger's farm when you didn't have to. Who would work from dawn to dusk without complaint, who would treat a woman as an equal partner instead of someone to be managed or dismissed." "Yes, Daniel. I think you're a good man." Daniel reached up then, his fingers barely touching her cheek. "You don't know what you're saying." "Then tell me. Help me understand." For a moment Sadie thought he might. She could see the words forming, the truth struggling to surface. But then he stepped back, the moment broken. "The storm's passing," he said, though rain still drummed against the windows. "I should check on the animals." He was gone before Sadie could protest. leaving her alone by the fire with more questions than answers and the lingering warmth of his touch on her cheek. The next morning dawned clear and cooler, the storm having broken the oppressive heat. Sadie found Daniel already up and working, cleaning debris from the storm drains they'd dug the night before. He greeted her with careful politeness, but the easy intimacy of recent weeks seemed to have retreated behind walls of formal courtesy. They worked through the morning assessing storm damage, which proved less severe than feared. The crops had weathered the deluge well, and only minor repairs were needed to buildings and fences. But the emotional distance Daniel maintained was more troubling to Sadie than any physical damage. "The corn should be ready for first harvest within the week," she said as they walked through the fields, trying to recapture their former easy conversation. "Good," Daniel replied. "I'll need to arrange for buyers soon." It was a businesslike response, focused on practical matters with no trace of the warmth that had characterized their recent interactions. Sadie felt the loss of that warmth more keenly than she cared to admit. That afternoon, a stranger rode into their yard, a well-dressed man on an expensive horse, his clothes and bearing marking him as someone of importance. Daniel stiffened when he saw the visitor, his face going carefully blank. "Mr. Harper?" the stranger called out as he dismounted. "I'm Williams from the Cattlemen's Association. I've been looking for you." Sadie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The way Williams spoke suggested this was no casual business call, and Daniel's obvious tension confirmed her fears. "What can I do for you, Mr. Williams?" Daniel asked, his voice carefully neutral. Williams glanced meaningfully at Sadie. "Perhaps we could speak privately?" "Miss Malone is my partner in this enterprise," Daniel said firmly. "Anything you have to say can be said in front of her." Williams looked skeptical but shrugged. "Very well. I'm here on behalf of your father, Mr. Harper. He's been concerned about your extended absence." Sadie's mind reeled. Father? But Daniel had never mentioned a living father, had spoken as though he was entirely alone in the world. "I told him I needed time to think," Daniel said, his jaw tight. "That hasn't changed." "Perhaps not. But circumstances have. Your father's taken ill, seriously ill. The doctors aren't certain he'll recover." Sadie saw the impact of these words on Daniel, the way his face went pale beneath his tan. Whatever complex relationship existed between him and his father, the news of illness clearly affected him deeply. "How long has he been sick?" Daniel asked quietly. "Nearly a month now. He's been asking for you daily." Daniel was silent for a long moment, staring out over the fields they'd worked so hard to cultivate. "I can't just leave. There are responsibilities here, commitments I've made." Williams followed his gaze to the thriving crops, then looked at Sadie with new understanding. "I see. Well, your father hoped you might feel that way. He's prepared to compensate Miss Malone for any losses incurred by your departure. Quite generously, I'm told." Sadie felt anger flare in her chest. "I don't want compensation from strangers. I want my partner to honor his commitments." "Sadie," Daniel said quietly, "you don't understand. My father, he's not a man who's easily refused." "Then perhaps it's time you learned to refuse him," Sadie replied, though her heart was already breaking at the resigned look in Daniel's eyes. Williams cleared his throat. "I'll be staying at the hotel in town tonight. I can give you until tomorrow to make arrangements." After Williams left, Daniel and Sadie stood in the yard in painful silence. The afternoon sun slanted across the fields, illuminating the crops that represented months of shared labor and growing trust. "You're going to leave," Sadie said finally. "It wasn't a question. I don't have a choice." "There's always a choice." Daniel turned to face her then, and Sadie saw something breaking behind his eyes. "Not for someone like me." Not when duty and family obligation call. And what about your obligations here? What about our partnership? I'll make sure you're provided for. The harvest should bring enough too. I don't want your money. Sadie's voice cracked with the effort of containing her emotions. I want what we built here. I want the life we were making together. Daniel stepped toward her, his own composure cracking. Sadie, if things were different, if I were different, you were different. Here with me working this land, that's who you really are. Not whatever role your father wants you to play. You don't know what you're asking. My father owns half of Texas. The Harper name carries weight and responsibility that. Harper. Sadie's mind seized on the name, pieces of half-remembered conversations clicking into place. Not just any Harper. You're talking about James Harper, the cattle baron. Daniel's silence was confirmation enough. Dear God, Sadie whispered. You're not just wealthy. You're one of the wealthiest men in the territory. Does it matter? It matters because you lied to me. Every day, every conversation, every moment we've shared, all of it built on deception. Not deception. Not about the things that mattered. How can I believe that? How can I believe anything you've told me? Daniel reached for her, but Sadie stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself as if she could hold the pieces of her breaking heart together through sheer will. The man I thought I was falling in love with doesn't exist, she said quietly. Sadie, please. That man, the one who worked beside you, who learned from you, who cared for you, he's real. He's more real than anything else in my life. But he's not free to make his own choices, is he? When his father calls, he has to go regardless of what he's leaving behind. Daniel's face was etched with pain. I wish it were that simple. It is that simple. You just don't want to see it. That evening, Daniel packed his few belongings while Sadie sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The cabin felt hollow already, emptied of the warmth that had grown between them over the summer months. I'll send someone to help with the harvest, Daniel said as he prepared to leave. And funds to cover your expenses through the winter. Sadie didn't look up from the fire. Will you come back? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the hopes and dreams they'd built together. I don't know, Daniel said finally, and the honesty of it was more painful than any lie might have been. After he left, Sadie sat alone in the cabin they'd shared, listening to the silence where his voice should have been, feeling the absence where his presence had become as natural as breathing. Outside, the crops they'd planted together swayed in the evening breeze, ready for harvest but lacking the hands that had tended them with such care. The rich soil her father had praised, the land that had seemed blessed with potential, now felt like a monument to dreams that had been allowed to grow too large too fast, only to be cut down before they could reach full bloom. Autumn arrived with a vengeance, bringing early frosts that threatened the late crops and a loneliness that settled into Sadie's bones like winter cold. True to his word, Daniel had sent men to help with the harvest. Efficient workers who did their jobs well but spoke little and knew nothing about the careful balance of partnership she'd shared with their absent employer. The corn yield exceeded all expectations, the golden ears filling wagon after wagon until Sadie lost count of the loads heading to market. The wheat had done equally well, commanding top prices from buyers who praised the quality of the grain. By any practical measure, their farming venture had been a stunning success. But success felt hollow when celebrated alone. Each evening, Sadie sat at her kitchen table calculating profits that would have thrilled her months earlier, knowing that half belonged to a man who might never return to claim them. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was more financially secure than she'd ever been, yet felt poorer than during her darkest days after her father's death. 6 weeks after Daniel's departure, Sadie received a letter delivered by the same well-dressed messenger who'd taken him away. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seal, recognizing Daniel's careful script. "Dear Sadie," it began, and her heart clenched at the informal address. "I hope this letter finds you well and the harvest successful. I've received reports that the yields exceeded our projections, which speaks to your exceptional skill and dedication." The formal tone continued for several paragraphs, discussing business matters and financial arrangements with the careful distance of a man writing to a business associate rather than someone who'd shared his meals and confidences for months. But near the end the mask slipped slightly. "I think of the farm often, of the morning light across the cornfields and the way the kitchen smelled when you were baking bread. I think of conversations by the fire and the satisfaction of work shared between partners who trusted each other completely. I hope you know that whatever else has happened, those memories remain among the most precious of my life." The letter was signed simply Daniel, and enclosed was a bank draft for an amount that made Sadie's eyes widen. Her half of the profits was substantial, but this was far more than their agreement had specified. 3 days later, another visitor arrived, a woman this time traveling in a carriage that spoke of wealth and position. She was perhaps 40 years old, handsome rather than beautiful, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take the measure of everything they observed. "Miss Malone," the woman said as she stepped down from her carriage. "I'm Catherine Morrison, Daniel Harper's aunt. I wonder if we might speak." Sadie invited her into the cabin, noting how the woman's gaze lingered on details. The mended furniture, the carefully preserved vegetables hanging from the rafters, the account books stacked neatly on the table. Catherine Morrison was clearly someone accustomed to reading situations quickly and accurately. "You have a lovely home," Catherine said as she accepted Sadie's offer of coffee. "Daniel wrote that you've made remarkable improvements to the property." "We both worked hard," Sadie replied carefully, uncertain what this visit might portend. Catherine smiled, and Sadie caught a glimpse of resemblance to Daniel in the expression. "From what I understand, you did considerably more than work hard. You turned my nephew into a farmer, which many would have considered impossible. He was already a good man. I just taught him about crops and soil. I think you taught him considerably more than that." Catherine sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Tell me, Miss Malone, what do you know about Daniel's father?" Sadie chose her words carefully. "I know he's wealthy and powerful. I know Daniel feels obligated to him despite some kind of conflict between them. James Harper is one of the most successful cattlemen in Texas, but success came at a considerable cost. Daniel's mother died when he was 12 and James, well, grief affects different men in different ways. James threw himself into building his empire, while Daniel was sent away to school, then college, then expected to take his place in the family business without any real say in the matter." Sadie began to understand. Daniel never wanted the life his father planned for him. Daniel wanted to make his own way, prove himself on his own merits rather than living in his father's shadow. When James announced his intention to arrange a marriage for Daniel, a business alliance with another cattle family, Daniel finally rebelled. He disappeared one night, leaving behind everything his father had built for him, and came here, and found something his father's money couldn't buy, a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Catherine leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Miss Malone, I won't pretend to know the exact nature of your relationship with my nephew, but I've seen the change in him. The letters he's written, the way he speaks of this place and of you. He's found something here worth more than all his father's cattle." Sadie felt her heart tighten with both hope and pain. Then why did he leave? Because James Harper is dying, and even rebellious sons find it difficult to ignore a father's deathbed summons. Catherine's voice gentled. But also because Daniel believes his presence here has compromised your reputation and your future. He thinks the kindest thing he can do is disappear from your life, leaving you free to build the kind of respectable future a woman in your position deserves. That's not his decision to make. No, it isn't. Which is why I'm here. Catherine reached into her reticule and withdrew an envelope. James Harper died 3 days ago. Daniel is now one of the wealthiest men in the territory, with responsibilities and expectations that will tie him to Texas for the foreseeable future. Unless what? Unless someone gives him a reason to choose differently. Someone whose opinion matters more to him than duty or obligation or the weight of family expectations. Sadie stared at the envelope in Catherine's hands. What are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to come to Texas. To attend James Harper's funeral as Daniel's friend. To see the life he's inherited and decide for yourself whether the man you knew here could find happiness in that world, or whether he needs to choose between his inheritance and his heart. The suggestion was shocking, improper, and utterly impossible. An unmarried woman traveling alone to attend the funeral of a man she'd never met, claiming friendship with his son when their relationship had been something far more complex and intimate than friendship. It went against every rule of decent behavior Sadie had been raised to follow. I can't, she said finally. It wouldn't be proper. Catherine smiled. My dear, nothing about Daniel's time here was entirely proper, yet it seems to have been the happiest period of his adult life. Sometimes propriety must bow to deeper truths. What deeper truths? That two people who found genuine partnership and love shouldn't let convention or circumstances separate them without a fight. That a man who spent months learning to see the world through your eyes might need reminding of what he'd be giving up if he buries himself in his father's legacy. Sadie walked to the window, looking out over the fields she and Daniel had worked together. The stubble of harvested corn caught the afternoon light, and she could almost see him there, learning to read the soil's needs, asking questions with the eager curiosity of someone discovering a new world. If I came, she said slowly, what exactly would I be walking into? A world of wealth and power that Daniel never wanted but now feels obligated to accept. Lawyers and business associates who see him as James Harper's heir rather than the man he's become. Social expectations that would require him to marry appropriately and produce the next generation of Harper cattle barons. And you think my presence would change any of that? I think your presence would remind him that he has choices. That the life he built here, the man he became through honest work and genuine partnership, doesn't have to disappear just because his father is dead. That evening, Sadie sat by her fire with Catherine's envelope unopened on the table beside her. Inside, Catherine had explained, were train tickets and the address of the Harper Ranch, along with a letter of introduction that would ensure her proper reception as a family friend. The sensible course was clear: stay home, accept the generous payment Daniel had sent, and build a life on the foundation of financial security their partnership had provided. She could hire help for the farm, perhaps eventually find a suitable husband among the local men who'd shown interest since her circumstances had improved. But sense warred with the memory of summer evenings when Daniel's presence had made the cabin feel like home, mornings when they'd worked side by side in perfect understanding, moments when she glimpsed the man beneath the careful facade he maintained for the world. The next morning, Sadie began making preparations for travel. The train journey to Texas took 3 days, giving Sadie ample time to question her decision and imagine all the ways this impulsive journey might end in humiliation. But as the landscape changed from familiar farming country to the vast expanses of cattle territory, she found herself curious despite her apprehensions. This was the world Daniel had been born to, the life he'd rejected in favor of 40 acres and a partnership with a woman whose entire inheritance wouldn't have bought a decent horse on his father's ranch. The Harper Ranch, when she finally saw it, defied even her expanded expectations. The main house was a sprawling structure that could have housed half the population of her home county, surrounded by outbuildings, corrals, and pastures that stretched to the horizon. Men on horseback moved cattle in the distance, their figures tiny against the vast landscape. A carriage met Sadie at the station, driven by a man who greeted her respectfully but without familiarity. During the ride to the ranch, she tried to imagine Daniel in this setting, tried to reconcile the man who'd learned farming from her with the heir to this vast operation. Catherine Morrison met her at the front door, embracing her warmly despite their brief acquaintance. "Sadie dear, I'm so glad you came. Daniel doesn't know you're here. I thought it best to let you decide how and when to reveal yourself." The house was filled with people. Family members, business associates, prominent cattlemen who'd come to pay their respects to James Harper. Sadie felt overwhelmed by the obvious wealth and sophistication around her, acutely aware of her simple traveling dress and modest baggage. "Don't let them intimidate you," Catherine murmured as she led Sadie through the crowded rooms. "Most of these people are here because they want something from Daniel, not because they cared about his father." They reached a quiet parlor where Catherine closed the door behind them. "Daniel's in his father's study, going through papers with the lawyers. He's been closeted there for hours, trying to understand the full scope of what he's inherited." "How is he?" Sadie asked, the question she'd been carrying for hundreds of miles. "Overwhelmed. Grieving. Trapped by obligations he never wanted but can't see how to refuse." Catherine's voice was gentle but frank. "He looks like a man serving a life sentence." Through the window, Sadie could see part of the vast ranch operation. Men working cattle, horses being trained, the endless business of managing an empire built on land and livestock. It was impressive and intimidating, representing a kind of success most people could only dream of. "I can see why he'd feel trapped," she said quietly. "Can you? Even knowing that he has choices." "What choices?" "This isn't just wealth, it's responsibility. All these people, their livelihoods, the families who depend on this operation. How could he walk away from that?" Catherine studied her carefully. "Is that what you think he should do? Walk away?" Sadie considered the question honestly. "I think he should make the choice that lets him live with himself. Whether that's staying or leaving. And if staying means losing what you built together?" The pain of that possibility was sharp and immediate, but Sadie forced herself to face it. "Then that's the price of doing what's right." Catherine smiled. "No wonder he fell in love with you." Before Sadie could respond to that startling statement, the parlor door opened and Daniel stepped inside. He was dressed in formal black for morning, his hair neatly trimmed, every inch the prosperous rancher's son. But when he saw Sadie, the careful composure cracked completely. "Sadie?" His voice was barely above a whisper, as if he feared she might be a mirage brought on by grief and exhaustion. "Hello, Daniel." For a moment they simply looked at each other across the elegant room, the space between them charged with months of separation and unspoken longing. Then Daniel was moving, crossing the room in quick strides to stop just out of arm's reach. "What are you doing here?" "I came to pay my respects. And to see if you were all right." Daniel's laugh held no humor. "All right? I'm the heir to an empire I never wanted, surrounded by people who see me as my father's replacement, expected to marry a woman I don't love and spend my life managing cattle when all I want is to go home to a little farm and the woman who taught me what partnership really means." The raw honesty of his words hit Sadie like a physical blow. "Daniel? I left to protect you, Sadie. To give you the chance at a normal life with a man who could offer you respectability and a future that wouldn't require constant explanations and justifications. Don't you think that should have been my choice to make? You don't understand what you'd be taking on. This world, these people, they'd never accept a farmer's daughter, no matter how remarkable she might be. Sadie felt anger flare alongside her pain. So you decided for both of us? Determined what I could and couldn't handle, what I did or didn't deserve. I was trying to do the right thing. The right thing would have been trusting me enough to tell me the truth from the beginning. Trusting me enough to let me decide what kind of life I wanted to build. Daniel moved to the window, staring out at the ranch that now belonged to him. And what kind of life is that, Sadie? What could I offer you here that wouldn't feel like exile from everything you know and love? Sadie joined him at the window, studying the vast landscape that represented both opportunity and obligation. I don't know. But I know what you offered me back home: partnership, respect, the chance to build something meaningful with someone who saw me as an equal. Maybe that's enough. It was enough when I was nobody. When I was just Daniel Harper, failed cowhand trying to learn farming. But now you're Daniel Harper, owner of the largest ranch in 3 counties, with the power to change lives and shape the future of this territory. Sadie turned to face him. That doesn't have to be a prison sentence, doesn't it? Every decision I make affects hundreds of people. Every choice has consequences that ripple out across the community. How do I choose my own happiness over their livelihoods? Who says you have to choose? What if there was a way to honor your responsibilities and still build the kind of life you want? Daniel studied her face, hope and skepticism warring in his expression. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe the skills that made you a good farming partner might also make you a different kind of rancher. One who treats his workers as partners rather than employees, who builds community rather than just empire. You think I could change how this place operates? I think you could do anything you set your mind to, if you had the right partner to help you figure it out. The air between them was charged with possibility and risk, the future hanging in the balance of words not yet spoken. Daniel reached out, his fingers barely brushing Sadie's cheek. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that if you want a partner for whatever comes next, I'm willing to learn about cattle the way you learned about corn. I'm saying that maybe love is worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. Daniel's arms came around her then, pulling her close with the desperation of a man who'd thought he'd lost everything that mattered. Sadie, I love you. I've loved you since that first morning when you taught me how to read the soil, maybe before that when you stood so brave and proud at the auction. But this life, this responsibility, I can't ask you to sacrifice your dreams for mine. You're not asking. I'm choosing. Just like you chose to help a stranger keep her farm, just like you chose to learn a new way of life because it felt right. Sadie pulled back enough to meet his eyes. Daniel, I don't need you to be poor to prove your love. I need you to be the man who sees me as an equal partner, regardless of how much money is in the bank. The people here, the society you'd be entering, it won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is. But we learned that together, remember? Building something worth having takes work and patience and the willingness to keep trying even when the weather turns bad. Daniel's smile was the first genuine expression of happiness Sadie had seen since arriving in Texas. Are you proposing to me, Miss Malone? I'm proposing a partnership, Mr. Harper. Same terms as before: equal investment, shared labor, mutual respect, and a 50-50 split of whatever we manage to build together. Those are terms I can accept, Daniel said, and then he was kissing her, months of separation and uncertainty dissolving in the warmth of reunion and recommitment. When they finally broke apart, Catherine Morrison was standing in the doorway, smiling broadly. I take it congratulations are in order? Aunt Catherine, Daniel said, keeping one arm firmly around Sadie's waist, I'd like you to meet my fiancée, Sadie Malone. We've met, Catherine replied cheerfully. And I must say she's exactly what this family has needed for a very long time. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, small by Harper standards but perfect by Sadie's measure. They were married in the ranch's chapel, with Catherine as matron of honor and half the county in attendance despite the relatively short notice. Sadie wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit and trimmed with lace that had traveled west in a covered wagon, while Daniel stood at the altar in a simple black suit rather than the elaborate formal where his position might have demanded. The ceremony was conducted by the local minister, but Daniel had insisted on writing their own vows, promises that spoke of partnership and equality, of shared dreams and mutual support through whatever challenges lay ahead. When Sadie promised to love him whether he was rich or poor, farmer or rancher, Daniel's voice broke slightly as he repeated similar words back to her. The reception was held in the ranch's main parlor, with food prepared by the household staff but music provided by local musicians who knew the kinds of songs people actually wanted to dance to. Sadie was surprised by the warmth of her reception from Daniel's employees, men who'd worked for his father but seemed genuinely hopeful that the new generation might bring positive changes to the operation. "Mrs. Harper," said Tom Bradley, the ranch foreman, as he claimed a dance with the bride, "the boys are looking forward to working with you and Daniel. Word is you know something about managing land and making things grow." "I know something about crops," Sadie replied. "I'm hoping to learn about cattle from people who know what they're doing." Tom smiled. That's exactly the kind of attitude old Mr. Harper never had. He knew everything there was to know or thought he did. Daniel, now he asks questions, listens to answers. That's going to make all the difference. As winter settled over the ranch, Sadie began to understand what Daniel had inherited and what they might build together. The Harper Ranch was indeed vast and prosperous, but it was also inefficient in ways that spoke to James Harper's autocratic management style. Workers were discouraged from suggesting improvements, land was managed for immediate profit rather than long-term sustainability, and the surrounding community saw the ranch as a necessary but distant presence rather than a partner in regional development. "What if we started smaller operations on some of the outlying properties?" Sadie suggested one evening as they reviewed maps and ledgers in what had been James Harper's private study. "Test some of the farming techniques we used back home, see if we can diversify the income streams." Daniel looked up from the correspondence he'd been sorting. "You think we can make cattle and crops work together?" "I think we can make anything work if we approach it as partners rather than trying to control everything from the top down." Sadie moved to stand behind his chair, her hands resting on his shoulders. "What does your instinct tell you?" Daniel leaned back against her, the gesture natural and comfortable despite their elegant surroundings. "My instinct tells me you're right. It also tells me we're going to face considerable resistance from people who think we're too young and too idealistic to manage an operation this size. Let them think that. We'll prove them wrong the same way we prove them wrong about farming, one successful season at a time." Spring brought validation of their approach when the experimental crop plots Sadie had insisted on planting yielded better than expected results. The diversification strategy began to show promise, and word spread that the new management at the Harper Ranch was worth watching. By summer, other ranchers were asking for advice on soil management and sustainable land use. "You've started something," Daniel told Sadie one evening as they sat on the porch of their newly renovated home, watching the sunset paint the vast landscape in shades of gold and crimson. "The whole territory is talking about the Harper Ranch's new methods." Sadie smiled, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child grew. "We've started something. This was always about partnership, remember?" Daniel's hand covered hers, his touch gentle and protective. "Equal partners in everything." "Equal partners in everything," Sadie agreed, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky above the land they'd learned to love together. The autumn harvest celebration that year was the largest the ranch had ever hosted, bringing together neighboring families, ranch employees, and community leaders for a festival that combined the best traditions of cattle country with the agricultural wisdom Sadie had brought from her farming background. Children played in the hay bales while adults shared food and music, creating the kind of community celebration that had been missing from the Harper Ranch during James Harper's more isolated reign. "This is what I always dreamed of," Daniel told Sadie as they danced under the stars, her pregnancy just beginning to show in the soft curve of her figure. "Not just the success but the sense of belonging somewhere, of building something that benefits everyone." Sadie looked around at the faces surrounding them, workers and neighbors, friends and family, all celebrating together the fruits of honest labor and shared prosperity. "We built this together. All of us." "Yes," Daniel agreed, spinning her gently in the starlight. "But it started with a partnership between two people who were brave enough to trust each other, even when trust seemed impossible." As the music played and the community celebrated around them, Sadie reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from the desperation of an auction yard to the prosperity of the Harper Ranch, from strangers thrown together by circumstance to partners who'd chosen love over convention, who'd built something beautiful from the foundation of mutual respect and shared dreams. The land stretched out around them in all directions, vast and full of promise, tended by people who understood that true wealth came not from owning the earth but from working in partnership with it. And at the center of it all, Sadie and Daniel continued their dance, equal partners in love and life, their future as bright and endless as the Texas sky above them.